Hello, History 362. So today we're going to do a kind of narrative, blow by blow, of Seleucid history in the 3rd century BC, from the reign of Antiochus I down to around 200 BC, still in the reign of Antiochus III, but before his problems with the Romans really break out. So we kind of, I think when we left off in our narrative, Antiochus I succeeds his father. He faces a whole host of challenges, a revolt in Syria, a Galatian invasion, and one additional challenge that he faces is actually one that is going to determine Seleucid foreign policy down into the 2nd century BC, and that is a war with the Ptolemaic dynasty over Coeli, Syria. And the roots of this war actually go all the way back to the Battle of Ipsus, when Seleucus I and Ptolemy I are allies, Ipsus in 301 BC, remember. And they had, it seems before the battle, worked out a kind of rough territorial understanding of what part of Antigonus One-Eye's territory everybody would get. Seleucus later claimed that he was promised Coeli, Syria. But Ptolemy, whose forces are not at the battle, even though he's part of this alliance, occupies Coeli, Syria, and in this instance, possession is about 10/10 of the law. So we have this disputed territory. Now, Coeli, Syria, Coeli means hollow. Hollow is an empty. And it refers to kind of the huge hollow, geologic rift that is formed first by the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains called the Bequa Valley, and then the Jordan River Valley bounded going into the Gaza Strip, which, of course, this whole region is not only very economically productive, a lot of great farmland along the Jordan River, the Gaza Strip in later antiquity is going to be famous for its wines. It's also strategically important. If you're going to invade Egypt from the outside, it's the main invasion route. And the nice thing about it is if you control Egypt, you can throw up a whole bunch of choke point defenses along these various narrows, particularly between the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains, and keep foreign invaders out. And that's why Ptolemy wants it. So the Seleucids and Ptolemies are therefore going to be routinely in a state of both diplomatic hostility, and they're going to fight a series of wars over Coeli, Syria. And these wars are collectively referred to as the Syrian Wars. And the first one of these takes place in the 270s BC between Antiochus I and Ptolemy II. As far as we can tell, it's a draw. It's a war for which we are not well informed about. But suffice it to say, this is just another military challenge that Antiochus I faces in his reign. Now, Antiochus I dies in 261, is succeeded by his son, also named Antiochus II. And Antiochus II also fights a war. This is the Second Syrian War. And this Syrian War is, as far as we can tell, a real Seleucid loss. Again, the military details, we don't have them, but we do know what the diplomatic fallout is. Namely, Antiochus II, at the end of this war, as part of the peace settlement, divorces his wife, or agrees to divorce his wife, Laodice. And Laodice, we actually know, gets a really good divorce settlement. A lot of estates in Asia Minor, which are tested epigraphically, so she's given a lot of property to kind of buy her out of this marriage. Now, the importance of this divorce is she has 2 sons. One is named Seleucus and one is named Antiochus. And these guys are almost of age and they are plausible successors. But instead, Antiochus II marries the sister of Ptolemy III, Berenike. So now he's marrying a Ptolemaic princess, which also means now that there's going to be Ptolemaic genes in the Seleucid bloodline should the child that they have, and they do have a boy shortly after, should this child be the one who inherits the Seleucid throne. So the fact that the outcome of the war is the Ptolemies basically injecting themselves into the Seleucid dynasty, into their genetics, quite literally, suggests that it's a bad loss for the Seleucids, even if we don't really have the military details of why it's such a bad loss. One thing that should be noted is that there was a lot of Ptolemaic forces up in the Biqua Valley, in between in what's now Lebanon, and they're actually in a position, if the things go well militarily, to threaten the Seleucid Tetropolis in the key royal centers like Seleucia, Pieria, and Antioch. So Antiochus II dies in or around 246, and this leads to a brand new war, the Third Syrian War, sometimes called the Laodicean War, because Laodice, this divorced queen, seems to be a key player as she arranges for her two sons to have a shot at actually inheriting the kingdom. Now, as it is, there's these two young men, Seleucus and Antiochus, who are the basically grown sons of the late king. But there's also this infant boy, the infant son of Berenike, who also is the son of the late king. And Ptolemy III therefore invades to assert the rights of his nephew. And it seems that his invasion may actually be initially welcomed by certain Seleucid factions. So he lands, he occupies Antioch. He actually sends his heavy phalanx deep into Seleucid territory and marches as far as Babylon. So if in terms of Laodice and her sons, this is initially a disaster. That being said, Laodice arranges for the baby boy to be murdered in a spasm of internal court violence. So therefore, the potential heir is lost. And she and her sons, who have moved into Asia Minor, are able to hold out until Ptolemy III feels compelled to withdraw. Of course, one question is, well, why does he withdraw? It doesn't seem he's forced out militarily, although, again, the military details are poorly understood, and it's possible that he does suffer some kind of military reverse. But it seems the main reason is there's some kind of revolt back in Egypt. And next week, we'll talk about the Ptolemies and how vulnerable they are to what happens if their Egyptian peasants revolt when the Ptolemaic army is somewhere else. So he pulls all of his heavy infantry, his big phalanx, he pulls that out and back to Egypt. And this allows Seleucus II to now take the throne. Someone who basically owes his royal position entirely to his mother. Laodice is yet another, kind of like Olympias, another iron Hellenistic queen who is willing to go to great lengths to make sure that her sons and her descendants' political success is guaranteed. Now, that's not the end for the problems of Seleucus II and his empire, because remember, he has a brother, Antiochus, a younger brother, a cadet prince. And Antiochus decides, well, why can't I be king? And he revolts. He's often referred to as Antiochus Hyrax, Antiochus the Hawk. He revolts, and not only is Seleucus II unable to quash this revolt, Antiochus is still in Asia Minor, he's still in modern-day Anatolia, but basically the Seleucids lose complete control over Anatolia. The Galatians are running amok, and the person who benefits from this anarchy is Attalus I. Attalus I is at this point, the dynast of Pergamon. He's a descendant of Philotirus. And he takes this chaotic opportunity to proclaim himself king, Basileus. So now we actually have another official king in this constellation of Hellenistic kings. And Attalus crushes the Galatians. He crushes Antiochus Hyrax, and Antiochus Hyrax flees, has a brief kind of violent, some brief violent adventures as a kind of brigand, and then is killed in Thrace, supposedly by brigands or raiders. So that's the end of Antiochus Hyrax. But the Seleucids are still, Seleucus II is still shut out of Asia Minor because now Attalus is claiming a lot of Seleucid territory in Asia Minor, claiming more than just the city of Pergamon, but is stepping into this vacuum created by this so-called war between the brothers, the name given to the war between Seleucus II and Antiochus Hyrax in the 230s BC. And this isn't the only catastrophic thing that happens. Not only does Seleucus II lose Asia Minor, it seems at this point that in the east, several regions take advantage of this chaos, both the chaos of the Third Syrian War and the chaos of the war between the brothers, to essentially schism off and form their own independent kingdoms. One region that does so is Parthia. Parthia is located in kind of northern Iran, right near the interface between the sort of Iranian highlands and the Eurasian steppe coming off near the Caspian Sea. Initially, the satrap of Parthia rebels, but then he's killed when a group of nomadic invaders known as the Parni sweep in, and these invaders set up shop and subsequently are referred to as the Parthians, and they will continue to be major players. So now we have this whole breakaway region that's being ruled by, again, this kind of new nomadic society, although the Parthians may or may not give some kind of vague ceremony acknowledgement of Seleucid suzerainty. At least some Parthian kings may sort of acknowledge that they're Seleucid satraps based on how strong they think the Seleucid king is. But right now they're basically setting up shop for themselves. Also, Parthia isn't the only Seleucid satrap to break away. Another Seleucid satrap that breaks away is Bactria, where the local satrap simply proclaims himself also to be a king and starts running the show as an independent ruler. So now we have this breaking up of the Seleucid Empire. They've lost Asia Minor, they've lost Parthia, they've lost Bactria, and poor Seleucus II finally does maybe himself a favor and dies in or around 225, 224, perhaps falling off a horse. He's succeeded by his elder son, Seleucus III, and Seleucus III decides that he's going to take a large army and move up into Asia Minor to try to fight a war. It's an unsuccessful war in the end against Attalus, and this ends badly when his own officers kill him. They murder him, seemingly having lost faith in his leadership. So the Seleucid Empire is now at a nadir. And it's not impossible to imagine it just sort of cracking up altogether. It's already we've had some big breakaway kingdoms. But the king that comes to power in 223 is a young teenager named Antiochus. It's Antiochus III. And he will probably prove the most energetic and effective of all the Seleucid kings, although he comes to power in a terrible place because not only is his brother murdered in Asia Minor by the army, but right when he comes to power, the satrap of Persia rebels, aided by his brother, the satrap of Media. So now we have yet another area where the satrap is basically breaking away, proclaiming himself king, and it's yet another rebellion to worry about. Worse, as you're reading in your Polybius passage that for your weekly reading, Antiochus finds himself dominated by his overweening epiton pragmaton, Hermias, a man who he's basically inherited from probably both his brother and his father. And Hermias initially is quite successful in browbeating the young king to pursue his own policies. Now, for whatever reason, Antiochus is convinced that rather than going against the rebel satrap of Persia, Molon, rather than marching against Attalus, although he does send an army against Attalus, commanded by a kinsman named Achaeus, that he should instead open up a war against Ptolemy. There is a new Ptolemaic king, Ptolemy IV, and the justification seems to be, well, a king should only fight another king. And so Antiochus makes some initial personal campaigns against Ptolemy, but he just can't crack through the strong Ptolemaic positions in the Lebanon and anti-Lebanon mountains. Meanwhile, more disasters strike. The army that is sent against Molon in Persia is defeated and overwhelmed, and its general is killed. And to make matters worse, the commander that he sends against Attalus, Achaeus, in Asia Minor, also revolts and said, well, guess what? I'm the king. I'm the king now. So now we have Achaeus, a rebel pretender in Asia Minor. We have Molon in Persia and Media. We have also the Parthians in Parthia and also a Bactrian breakaway dynasty. So the Seleucid Empire is now in an even worse place. And this is where Antiochus starts to kind of put things together. He decides that he overrules Hermias and says, we're marching against Molon. He goes out with his army, and when the king personally appears before the rebel army, the Seleucid soldiers, probably the soldiers in who are clerics or katoikoi, the so-called Macedonians, defect from the pretender Molon when they actually see the king in person. So his own presence, the battle actually ends when the enemy army comes over to Seleucus, or at least part of the enemy army comes over to Antiochus. Sorry, I said Seleucus a minute ago. Comes over to Antiochus III, and the rest is then destroyed in the battle. And so Molon flees and commits suicide, and his body is propped up at the crossroads as an example to other would-be traitors and pretenders. At this point, Antiochus, who's clearly improved his own confidence and his own stature, also moves to take control of his court. He pretends to be sick, as you've read, and he says he's a doctor, and the doctor that he sees, Polyphanes, who is a kind of loyal figure, helps to secretly arrange the murder of Hermias. In fact, one problem that Antiochus has, and this goes back to the nature of royal power, is Hermias literally controls his bodyguards, he controls the people who work in his bedroom, and so he's really afraid that he'll get liquidated until he gives these secret orders under the pretext that he's just consulting privately with his doctor about his illness. And so they therefore arrange for Hermias to be murdered, and then they also savagely murder Hermias' wife and son, who are stoned to death in Antioch. Hellenistic royal politics can be quite brutal. Antiochus now renews the war against Ptolemy, and this time he catches a lucky break. The Aetolian mercenary commander in Coele, Syria, switches sides, and this allows Antiochus to get through what had previously been this heavily fortified strong point and enter into Coele, Syria, and is actually moving towards Egypt when the Ptolemies finally, after some sort of delaying negotiations, field a massive field army. And a huge battle was fought in 217 BC, the Battle of Raphia, one of the largest battles of the Hellenistic world. The Ptolemies, and we'll talk about this from the Ptolemaic side, but they are so desperate to counter Antiochus' army that they enroll Egyptian peasants into their army, and not just as sort of light troops, but as heavy pikemen. And the addition of these Egyptian heavy pikemen ultimately helps turn the tide. The battle is a defeat for Antiochus. He does very well. He personally commands his cavalry as if he's Alexander the Great, and briefly does very well. He's chasing the Ptolemaic cavalry off the battlefield, but kind of like Demetrius Poliorcetes is wanting to do, he keeps riding. He doesn't turn around and ride his cavalry to roll up the Ptolemaic line. And the mass of Ptolemaic pikemen, including these Egyptian pikemen, ultimately defeat the Seleucid phalanx, and Antiochus and his force are beaten and withdraw with heavy casualties. So we actually have a defeat. Interestingly, this defeat doesn't seem to faze Antiochus. He cuts a treaty with Ptolemy and then goes back, goes back, and then immediately sets to work dealing with his next problem, the pretender Achaeus up in Asia Minor. And he fights. We don't know all the details, but by 214 he has Achaeus pinned up in Sardis. He manages to, through deceit, to capture Achaeus, who is then mutilated. In fact, mutilated in the king's tent. Again, the king's tent is this kind of inner court when on campaign. They kill Achaeus. They mutilate him. And then he also his body is displayed as a warning to others. So by 214, Antiochus has dealt with at least a couple big problems: the revolt in Persia and Media, the revolt of Achaeus. He now decides that he's going to go east with a huge army, and the goal is to actually put these eastern satrapies back together. So this is the Anabasis of Antiochus the Great. He goes up through Ecbatana and then into Parthia, where he does seem to fight and win some battles against the Parthians, and forces the Parthians to acknowledge, while they continue to sort of be satraps, to acknowledge Seleucid power. Although, again, the Parthians are now still in charge of this region, as long as they've just sort of been humbled. He then moves on with his army into Bactria, where he supposedly besieges Bactria for nearly 2 years. And we do have Polybius is fragmentary at this point. We do have a report of a brisk cavalry battle with Bactrian forces, where Antiochus both fights bravely and also maybe takes a rock to the face that knocks out some of his teeth. Ultimately, Antiochus decides that he's going to acknowledge the king of Bactria, the king of Bactria, surrendering after the siege, or in peace negotiations after the siege, says, look, if I'm here, I can keep out all of the nomads coming off the Eurasian steppe. If you destroy me, who will do that? And Antiochus, maybe realizing that Bactria is is just too much for the Seleucids to truly control, decides to acknowledge this kingdom, so long as it, again, in turn acknowledges the sort of suzerainty of the Seleucid king. So Bactria, therefore, remains a kind of semi-independent kingdom, although, again, now as a kind of subaltern kingdom to Antiochus, who continues his Anabasis, and finally returns through Babylon in 205, and he's back in Asia Minor by 204. Actually, along the way, he does a shakedown of a number of kind of Arab communities along the Red Sea, demanding both goods and monies from them in exchange for not imposing regular taxation. So this is, I think this big march, this big event, on one hand does seem to legitimately improve the Seleucid position in the east. It's also a reminder, though, about how the kind of fragility of the Seleucid Empire, particularly as we get further and further away from Syria, that in order for it to, that the king and his movement kind of constitutes the empire. But what happens when you haven't seen the king in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years? No one but an old man remembers the last time the king came through here. It means that diminishes the probably quality of Seleucid power and the ability of the Seleucids to actually enforce their will in different regions. So as to say that Anabasis, at least for the moment, does improve the Seleucid position in the far east of the Zagros Mountains. So Antiochus is now back, in and around 204, the exact time isn't quite clear, he hears that Ptolemy IV has died. This means that Ptolemy V is a very small child, and this opportunity allows Antiochus to start a new war against the Ptolemies. This is the 5th Syrian War. The 4th Syrian War is the battle, it ends with the Battle of Raphia. This is the 5th Syrian War. Seleucid, Antiochus III does much better in this war. He succeeds in capturing Coele-Syria. He defeats the Ptolemaic army in a large battle at Panion. And the exact date is unclear, but it's anywhere between 200 and 198. And so by 198, Antiochus has finally achieved this long-held dynastic goal of capturing Coele-Syria. He's reconquered a great deal of Asia Minor, and his forces are now putting pressure on some of the Greek cities in Western Asia Minor, who had previously been largely independent, but now he's sort of menacing them with his army. And the peace treaty between that is eventually signed, probably in 196 BC, requires Ptolemy to marry Antiochus's daughter, Cleopatra Syrah. That's actually where the name Cleopatra goes into the Ptolemaic line. Therefore, doing the opposite of what Ptolemy had done to Antiochus II way back during the Second Syrian War. So by 196, Antiochus, the Seleucid kingdom, is probably at the peak of its power and prestige. Antiochus has proven himself an energetic king who is able to put his realm back together. The downside, and we will have to wait a little bit, is he now has Roman envoys pestering him, saying, we, the Romans, have guaranteed the freedom of the Greek cities in the east, and we'd like you to leave our good friend and ally Ptolemy alone. And Antiochus may not realize it, but his, the Seleucid kingdom at the high point is about to face a major blow. All right, it's a long lecture, but that's the Seleucids. Next week, we will continue our survey of our Hellenistic kingdoms and talk, I believe, about the Antigonids, or maybe it's the Ptolemies. I'm going to have to check the syllabus before I start recording my lectures. Anyway, I'll see you soon.